Hello, my friend. Welcome to your surgery story. My name is Dr. Mike, and it's my privilege to be with you tonight as you drift off to sleep. I'm a neurosurgeon, and over the years I've stood in operating rooms across this country, faced with cases that test everything I've learned, everything I've practiced, and sometimes everything I believe about what's possible. Tonight, I want to tell you about one particular night, a November evening when the emergency department called me down for a case I'll never forget. A construction accident. A man with a metal pole through his skull. I hope this story brings you to a place of calm focus, the kind of stillness I find in the operating room when everything else falls away and there's only the work, the patient, and the quiet determination to see it through. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and join me as I walk you through that long night in the hospital. It was just after 11 when my pager went off. I was in the physician's lounge, halfway through a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, reading through a journal article I'd been meaning to finish for weeks. The screen lit up with the familiar number from the emergency department. I set the journal down and stood up, feeling that familiar shift in my body, the way my mind begins to sharpen and focus even before I've seen the patient. Penetrating head injuries are some of the most challenging cases we face. The brain is delicate, unforgiving. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the consequences can be devastating. But there's also something clarifying about them. The problem is right there in front of you. No ambiguity, no waiting for test results to tell you what's wrong. You see it, you assess it, you act. I made my way down the hallway toward the emergency department, my footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. The hospital at night has a different quality to it. The lights seem dimmer, the sounds more muted. Most of the administrative staff have gone home. The cafeteria is closed. It's just the essential people now, the ones who keep the place running when the rest of the world is asleep. I passed a nurse pushing a medication cart, and she nodded at me. I nodded back. We didn't need to say anything. She knew where I was going, and I knew she'd be there if I needed her. That's how it works here. Everyone understands their role, and when something serious comes in, we all move together like parts of a single machine. The emergency department was bright and bustling when I arrived. There's always activity down here, even in the middle of the night, but tonight there was an extra edge to it. I could see it in the way people moved, the way they spoke to each other. Something significant was coming. I found the charge nurse near the central desk, and she pointed me toward Bay 12. "The trauma team is setting up there," she said. "They called ahead from the scene. It's bad." I thanked her and walked over, already running through possibilities in my mind. Penetrating head injury could mean a lot of things. Gunshot wound, knife, industrial accident. Each one comes with its own set of challenges, its own particular anatomy of damage. When I reached the bay, I saw the trauma surgeon, Dr. Reyes, already gowned and gloved, standing near a stretcher that was still empty. She looked up when I entered and gave me a quick nod. She's someone I've worked with many times, and I trust her judgment completely. "Mike," she said, "this one's unusual. Construction site accident. Patient was working on a high-rise renovation. Scaffolding collapsed, and he fell onto a vertical piece of rebar. It went through his face." I felt my stomach tighten slightly. Through his face. That could mean anything from a survivable injury to something catastrophically unsurvivable. "Where exactly?" I asked. She pulled up an image on the tablet she was holding, a photo that had been sent from the scene by the paramedics. I leaned in to look. The image was difficult to process at first. The man was conscious, sitting upright, and there was a steel pole, maybe half an inch in diameter, protruding from his face. It entered just below his right eye and exited somewhere near the top of his head. The pole had been cut down to about 18 inches on either side of his face, but it was still there, still embedded. His eyes were open. That's what struck me most. He was awake, looking at the camera, and there was an expression on his face that I can only describe as bewildered. Not panicked, not screaming, just confused, as if he couldn't quite understand what had happened to him. I stared at the image for a long moment, my mind already beginning to map out the anatomy. The pole had entered below the orbit, which meant it likely passed through the maxillary sinus, possibly the ethmoid sinus, and then up into the anterior cranial fossa. Depending on the angle, it could have gone through the frontal lobe, or it might have tracked more posteriorly toward the deeper structures. "He's stable," Reyes said, watching my face. GCS was 14 at the scene. "He's talking. He knows his name, where he is, what happened. Pupils are equal and reactive. No signs of active bleeding externally, but we won't know what's happening inside until we get imaging." I nodded slowly, still staring at the photos. A Glasgow coma scale of 14 meant he was neurologically intact, at least for now. That was remarkable given what I was looking at, but the brain is strange that way. You can have devastating injuries that don't show themselves immediately. Swelling takes time. Bleeding can be slow. The real danger often comes hours after the initial trauma. "We need to get him to CT as soon as he arrives," I said. "Full head and neck imaging. I want to see the trajectory of that pole, what structures it's touched, and whether there's any active bleeding. And we need to get the OR ready. I have a feeling we're going to be spending a long night together." Reyes nodded and turned to give orders to the nurses nearby. I stepped back and took a breath, letting my mind settle into the problem. This was going to be complex. Removing a foreign object from the brain is not like pulling a splinter from your finger. The object itself might be the only thing holding damaged blood vessels closed. The moment you remove it, you can have catastrophic bleeding, and the pole had clearly passed through the orbit, which meant the optic nerve was almost certainly involved. There was a very real chance this man would lose vision in that eye, if he hadn't already. But losing an eye was the least of our concerns right now. The priority was keeping him alive and preventing further damage to his brain. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later. I heard the sirens outside, and then the stretcher was rolling in, surrounded by paramedics and EMTs. I moved closer to get my first in-person look at the patient. He was a man in his mid-30s, wearing a torn work jacket and pants covered in dust and grime. His hands were clenched at his sides, and his breathing was fast but controlled. The pole was still there, just as it had been in the photo, a stark intrusion of metal and blood against the pale skin of his face. One of the paramedics, a woman with short gray hair, was giving report as they moved him into the bay. "This is Marcus Johnson, 34 years old, no known medical history. Fell approximately 15 feet onto exposed rebar." The pole entered below his right eye and exited through the superior parietal region. We stabilized the pole with padding and tape. "He's been conscious and alert the entire time, vitals stable. GCS 14. We started an IV and gave him a gram of ceftriaxone for infection prophylaxis." I stepped up to the side of the stretcher and leaned down so Marcus could see me. His left eye focused on me immediately. The right eye was obscured by blood and swelling, and I couldn't tell if it was even intact. "Marcus," I said quietly, "my name is Dr. Mike. I'm a neurosurgeon. You're at the hospital now, and we're going to take care of you. Can you hear me okay?" He nodded slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse but clear. "Yeah, I can hear you." It was surreal, hearing him speak with that pole still embedded in his skull. Most people would assume someone in his condition would be unconscious, unresponsive, but the brain doesn't always follow the rules we expect. "You're doing really well," I told him. "I know this is frightening, but I need you to stay as still as possible. We're going to take some pictures of your head so we can see exactly where that pole is, and then we're going to take you to surgery to remove it. Do you understand?" He blinked once, slowly. "Am I going to die?" he asked. It was a question I'd heard before, many times, and it never got easier. The truth was I didn't know, but I also knew that fear and panic could make things worse, could cause him to move or struggle or spike his blood pressure in ways that might trigger bleeding. So I did what I always do. I told him the truth, but I gave him hope. "You're in the right place," I said. "You're stable right now, and we have a whole team of people here who are very good at what they do. We're going to do everything we can to get you through this." Marcus nodded again, and I saw something in his eye that looked like trust. It's a strange thing, that moment when a patient decides to put their life in your hands. I don't take it lightly. I never have. We moved quickly after that. Marcus was transferred onto the CT scanner within minutes, and I stood in the control room with Reyes and the radiologist, Dr. Patel, watching as the images began to appear on the screen. CT scans are remarkable tools. They give us a window into the body that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago. But they're also stark and unforgiving. They show you everything, the good and the bad, and they don't lie. The first few slices came through, and I felt my breath catch. The pole had entered through the inferior orbit just as I'd suspected, shattering the orbital floor and passing through the ethmoid air cells. It had then continued upward, penetrating the anterior cranial fossa and entering the brain parenchyma. The trajectory took it through the right frontal lobe, tracking posteriorly and superiorly until it exited through the parietal bone near the vertex of the skull. Patel zoomed in on the images, and we studied them in silence. There was surprisingly little bleeding visible on the scan, just a small amount of hemorrhage along the track. But that didn't mean there wasn't bleeding. It just meant the bleeding was being controlled, either by the pole itself or by the body's natural clotting mechanisms. The real test would come when we removed the pole. "Look at this," Patel said, pointing to one of the slices. The pole passed within millimeters of the anterior cerebral artery. If it nicked that vessel, you're going to have significant bleeding when you pull it out. I nodded. The anterior cerebral artery supplies blood to the frontal lobes, and damage to it can cause devastating strokes. But there was no way to know for sure if it was injured until we were in there. "And the optic nerve?" Reyes asked, leaning closer to the screen. Patel scrolled to a different series of images, focusing on the orbit. The optic nerve appeared to be displaced, pushed laterally by the pole, but it didn't look completely transected. "That's better than I expected," I said. "There's a chance we can preserve some vision, but it's going to depend on how much damage was done to the nerve and whether there's adequate blood flow. We'll know more once we're in the OR." Reyes looked at me. "What's the plan?" I thought for a moment, mentally walking through the steps. This wasn't a straightforward case. Removing the pole too quickly could cause uncontrollable bleeding. Leaving it in too long increased the risk of infection and further brain injury. We needed to be methodical, careful, and ready for anything. "We need to stabilize the skull first," I said. "I want to do a craniotomy around the exit site so we have direct access to the brain and can control any bleeding from the inside. Once we have that exposure, we'll carefully remove the pole in a controlled fashion, working from the top down. We'll need vascular surgery on standby in case we run into trouble with the arteries, and ENT for the facial reconstruction afterward." Reyes nodded. "I'll make the calls." Patel printed out the images and handed them to me. "Good luck," he said. "You're going to need it." I took the images and headed toward the operating room. The hospital was quieter now, the night deepening. I passed through the surgical wing, where the lights were dimmer and the hallways empty. I could hear the faint hum of ventilation systems, the occasional beep of a monitor from one of the recovery rooms. It's a strange kind of peace, the calm before a big case. Your mind is already in the OR, already thinking through the steps, but your body is still walking through the physical world, still present in this in-between space. The OR was ready when I arrived. The scrub techs had laid out the instruments on sterile tables, and the anesthesiologist, Dr. Lindholm, was reviewing the monitors. I scrubbed in at the sink, the water hot against my hands, the soap turning to foam as I worked it under my nails, between my fingers, up to my elbows. It's a ritual, this scrubbing. A moment of transition. When you step into the OR, you leave everything else behind. Your worries, your distractions, your personal life. There's only the patient and the work. I gowned and gloved, feeling the familiar tightness of the surgical gloves, and stepped up to the table. Marcus was already under anesthesia, his head secured in a 3-point Mayfield clamp that held his skull perfectly still. The pole was still in place, now surrounded by sterile drapes that isolated the surgical field. The anesthesia team had intubated him and placed additional IV lines for fluid resuscitation and blood transfusions if needed. Lindholm looked up at me from behind the drapes. "He's stable," she said. "Blood pressure is a little elevated, but that's expected given the injury. I've got blood products ready if you need them." "Good," I said. "Let's get started." I positioned myself at the head of the table, with Reyes across from me and 2 assisting residents on either side. The scrub tech handed me the scalpel, and I paused for just a moment, looking down at the pole protruding from Marcus's skull. It was surreal, seeing it up close like this, a piece of industrial metal embedded in a human being. I took a breath and made the first incision. The scalp is thick and vascular, and it bled immediately, but the tech was ready with the Bovie electrocautery, sealing the vessels as I went. I worked carefully, creating a large U-shaped flap around the exit side of the pole. The goal was to expose enough of the skull to safely remove a section of bone and access the brain underneath. Once the scalp was reflected back, I could see the skull clearly. The pole had penetrated cleanly through the parietal bone, leaving a round hole about the width of a pencil. The bone around the hole was fractured in a starburst pattern, tiny cracks radiating outward from the impact site. I used a high-speed drill to create a craniotomy, carefully removing a section of skull about the size of my palm. The drill whined in the quiet of the OR, and I worked slowly, aware that one slip could cause irreversible damage. The bone came away in pieces, and I set them aside. Underneath was the dura mater, the tough membrane that covers the brain. It was tense, bulging slightly, a sign that there was pressure building underneath. I made a careful incision in the dura, and immediately I could see the brain tissue. The pole had created a tract through the frontal and parietal lobes, and there was blood along the path, dark and thick. But the bleeding wasn't active, which was a relief. The pole was still acting as a plug, holding the damaged vessels closed. Now came the delicate part. I needed to remove the pole without causing catastrophic bleeding. I signaled to Reyes, "Let's start mobilizing it from the top. We'll work slowly, millimeter by millimeter." She nodded, and together we began the process. I placed retractors to hold the brain tissue gently out of the way, and then I started to ease the pole upward, pulling it slowly from the exit site. The metal was slick with blood and cerebrospinal fluid, and it took a steady hand to keep it from slipping. Every few millimeters, I paused and checked for bleeding. So far, so good. As the pole came free from the parietal lobe, I could see the track it had created through the brain. The tissue was bruised and swollen, but the damage was surprisingly localized. The pole had been smooth, not jagged, and it had passed through without tearing or shredding the way a bullet might. That was in Marcus's favor. I continued pulling, and the pole slowly emerged from the brain. 5 inches, 6 inches, 7. And then I felt resistance. I stopped immediately. Something was caught. I leaned closer, using a surgical microscope to get a better view. The pole had reached the anterior cranial fossa, and I could see why it had stopped. It was hung up on the edge of the orbital roof, the thin shelf of bone that separates the eye socket from the brain. "I'm going to need more exposure down here," I said. "Reyes, can you extend the craniotomy anteriorly?" She nodded and reached for the drill. We worked together, carefully removing more bone to give me access to the front of the skull. The OR was silent, except for the sound of the drill and the steady beep of the monitors. Time seemed to stretch out, each moment expanding into the next. With the additional exposure, I could see the problem more clearly. The pole had fractured the orbital roof on its way in, and a small fragment of bone was caught on the metal. I used a fine curette to gently remove the bone fragment, and then I tried again. This time, the pole moved. It slid upward another inch, and I could feel it coming free. "Almost there," I said quietly. The team was watching intently, everyone focused on the same goal. I pulled again, slowly, and the pole continued to emerge. Now I could see the entry site, the point where it had penetrated through the orbit. The tissues there were mangled, blood and bone and soft tissue all mixed together. But the pole was coming out. Inch by inch it moved, and then finally, after what felt like an eternity, it was free. I held it up for a moment, this long piece of metal that had been inside a man's brain, and then I handed it off to the scrub tech. She placed it in a specimen container, evidence, and also a reminder of what we'd just accomplished. Now came the next challenge. I needed to inspect the entire tract for bleeding and repair any damage I could. I used the microscope to examine the path the pole had taken, looking for injured vessels. There, in the frontal lobe, I found a small arterial bleeder, a tiny vessel that had been torn. I cauterized it carefully, sealing it shut. Further along the tract, I found another and another. Each one was small, manageable, but together they could have been fatal if left unchecked. Race worked with me, suctioning blood and CSF, keeping the field clear so I could see. It was meticulous work, the kind that requires absolute focus. One wrong move, one moment of distraction, and you could cause more damage than you're trying to fix. As I worked, I thought about Marcus, about the fact that he was lying here on this table, unconscious, trusting us to put him back together. I thought about his life, the things he'd done, the people who cared about him. I didn't know any of those details, but I knew they existed. Everyone has a story, a web of connections that make them who they are. And right now, in this moment, his story depended on what I did with my hands. It's a humbling thought, and it's one that I carry with me every time I operate. After 30 minutes of careful inspection and repair, I was satisfied that the bleeding was controlled. The brain tissue was swollen, but it was viable. There was no gross contamination, no obvious signs of infection. I turned my attention to the dura, suturing it closed in a watertight fashion to prevent CSF leaks. Then I replaced the bone flap, securing it with titanium plates and screws. The scalp came together easily, and I closed it in layers, taking my time to ensure a clean closure. By the time I finished, it was nearly 4 in the morning. The OR was quiet, the monitors steady. Lindholm looked up at me. He's been stable throughout. No significant blood loss. Vitals are good. I nodded, feeling the exhaustion starting to creep in. Let's wake him up and see how he does. We waited as the anesthesia was reversed, and slowly Marcus began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around, confused and groggy. I leaned down where he could see me. "Marcus, you're okay. The surgery is done. We removed the pole. You did great." He blinked, and his left eye focused on me. His right eye was swollen shut, but there was no active bleeding. "Hurts," he mumbled. "I know," I said. "We're going to give you something for the pain, but you're through the worst of it now." He nodded slightly, and then his eyes closed again. We transferred him to the ICU, where he'd be monitored closely for the next several days. The days that followed were tense but hopeful. Marcus remained stable, his neurological function gradually improving. He regained movement on his left side, which had been slightly weak immediately after surgery. His speech was clear, his memory intact. The right eye, unfortunately, did not recover vision, the optic nerve too damaged to heal. But he was alive, and he was himself. 2 weeks after the surgery, I stopped by his room to check on him. He was sitting up in bed, talking to his wife, a woman with kind eyes and a tired smile. When he saw me, he smiled too. "Doc," he said, "I don't know how to thank you." I shook my head. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you're doing well." He reached out and shook my hand, and I saw the emotion in his face, the gratitude and the relief. "I'll never forget that night," he said. "Neither will I replied. "If you made it to the end, congratulations. You are part of the 1% of people who ever make it this far. But be sure to join me next time for my next surgery. Who knows, you may even be the patient." Tell me that you made it to the end in the comment section. See you in the next surgery.